July 1944. The Texas heat shimmered and danced like fractured glass across the endless desert, barbed wire cutting toward the horizon. Klaus Weber descended from the prison transport train, metal shackles biting deep into his wrists, bracing himself for the brutality he'd been told to expect from American captors. He'd absorbed the stories during interrogation, heard the warnings whispered among the crew about how Americans dealt with German prisoners. But then Camp Commander Mitchell did something that shattered every certainty Klaus had been clinging to. The commander offered him a cigar, not just any cigar, but a premium Montecristo. The kind of luxury that Klaus's own officers back home could barely imagine affording, especially now in wartime. Klaus stared at the expensive smoke, trembling slightly in his hands. "This is trick," he managed in halting English. Mitchell simply lit his own and smiled without malice. No trick, just rules. But as Klaus would discover in the days ahead, nothing about this Texas prison camp operated the way he'd been led to believe. The train's brakes shrieked violently against the steel rails as the cattle car jerked to its final stop, throwing Klaus against his neighbors. Through the narrow wooden slats, he caught glimpses of endless Texas scrubland, stretching toward a horizon that wavered and rippled in the merciless July heat. Inside the car, the air hung thick and choking, with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear-soaked wool uniforms. 42 German prisoners had been packed shoulder to shoulder for the 3-day journey from the East Coast Processing Center, and by the end, the atmosphere felt suffocating. Klaus pressed his eye against a gap between the planks and saw them waiting. American guards in khaki uniforms, rifles slung across their shoulders with easy confidence, their faces hard and weathered as the desert stone beneath their boots. The sight should have terrified him, but after watching his U-boat crew drown in the frigid Atlantic waters, Klaus had learned that fear was a currency he could no longer afford to spend. He pulled his father's compass from his breast pocket and checked it repeatedly, the familiar weight of brass and glass anchoring him just as it had during countless nights navigating enemy waters. "Remember," he whispered in German to Hans Müller, the young radio operator pressed against his shoulder, "name, rank, serial number, nothing else." Hans nodded, his Adam's apple working as he swallowed hard. At 19, the boy still carried the soft cheeks of someone who'd never learned that survival meant rationing every word, every gesture, every breath. Klaus had tried to shield him during the crossing, dividing his meager rations when Hans couldn't stomach food, but protection was about to become far more complicated than a shared meal. The doors burst open with a deafening crash that echoed across the desert air. Sunlight poured in like molten metal, momentarily blinding the prisoners who squinted and raised their shackled hands to shield their eyes. American voices barked orders in English that Klaus only partially understood, but the universal language of rifle barrels pointed in their direction required no translation. "Rouse! Rouse!" shouted a guard, who'd apparently learned just enough German to move prisoners efficiently. "Out, move!" Klaus was among the first to step down from the car, his legs unsteady after days of confinement. The Texas heat struck him like a physical blow. Dry, relentless, utterly different from the damp chill of the North Atlantic that had nearly claimed him. The ground beneath his feet was hard-packed earth and gravel, surrounded by double rows of barbed wire that gleamed silver in the afternoon sun. Guard towers rose at each corner of the compound, their shadows the only refuge from the blazing sky. The prisoners formed ragged lines as American soldiers prodded them with rifle butts toward a cluster of wooden buildings that looked hastily constructed but surprisingly well-maintained. Klaus had expected something closer to the camps the SS had whispered about in dark tones, places where enemies of the Reich simply vanished. Instead, he saw latrines that appeared functional, barracks with actual windows, and an American flag snapping crisply in the desert wind. Camp Commander John Mitchell emerged from the largest building, his uniform pressed despite the heat, his bearing upright but not threatening. He was older than Klaus expected, perhaps 45, with grey threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many difficult decisions. Mitchell approached the assembled prisoners and began speaking in carefully pronounced German, his accent thick but his meaning unmistakable. You will be treated according to Geneva Convention, Mitchell said, consulting a small notebook. You are prisoners, not animals. You will receive food, medical care, and opportunity to contact families through Red Cross. Klaus studied the commander's weathered face, searching for the cruelty he'd been trained to anticipate from American captors. Instead, he found something far more disturbing than brutality: genuine composure. Mitchell's voice carried no hatred, no triumph, no trace of contempt, just the steady tone of a man explaining rules that would be enforced whether prisoners liked them or not. That evening, as Klaus lay on his assigned bunk in the barracks, staring up at unfamiliar constellations visible through the window, a guard appeared at his bedside. The soldier was young, perhaps 22, with farm boy freckles and nervous energy. "Weber, Klaus?" the guard asked, consulting a clipboard. Klaus sat up slowly, his muscles still aching from the transport. "Ja, yes. Commander wants to see you. Now." The walk to Mitchell's office felt far longer than it actually was, Klaus's wooden shoes echoing against the planked walkway while other prisoners watched from barracks windows, their faces reflecting the same question that twisted in Klaus's stomach. Was this where the American mask of civility finally slipped away? Mitchell's office was sparsely furnished but immaculate, with maps of Texas covering one wall and a small radio crackling softly with American jazz. The commander sat behind a simple wooden desk, but what commanded Klaus's attention was the mahogany humidor beside a stack of papers. "Your submarine record shows you a navigator," Mitchell said in English, then repeated in broken German. "I need men who can read maps for work details." Klaus remained standing at attention, uncertain of protocol. "Yes, sir." "Navigator." Mitchell opened the humidor and withdrew 2 cigars, Cuban Montecristos, Klaus realized with shock. The kind of luxury that even German officers could rarely claim, particularly not in wartime. Mitchell offered one to Klaus with a gesture so casual it might have been occurring between old friends rather than between captor and prisoner. Klaus stared at the premium cigar, his mind racing through possibilities. "This is how you say." "Trick." Mitchell lit his own cigar with deliberate care, the flame casting dancing shadows across his weathered face. He drew deeply, exhaled slowly, then met Klaus's eyes with unsettling intensity. "No trick, just rules." But as Klaus walked back toward the barracks, the unlit Montecristo still clutched in his palm like a riddle he couldn't solve. He passed 2 guards sharing a cigarette outside the supply building. Their voices carried in the still night air. "Given the good stuff first," one guard chuckled, "makes him soft for later." The word struck Klaus like shrapnel. The tentative trust that had begun to take root withered instantly, replaced by the familiar armor of suspicion that had kept him alive through 4 years of war. Everything he'd imagined about American fairness, about Geneva Convention protections, about the possibility of dignity even in captivity, it was all illusion, just propaganda on both sides. The surveying work began 3 days later, just after dawn when the Texas heat was still manageable. Klaus found himself assigned to mapping irrigation channels for local cotton farms, his navigation skills apparently valuable enough to earn him temporary reprieve from the war itself. He worked alongside 5 other prisoners, including Hans, spreading topographical maps across makeshift tables beneath a canvas awning, while American guards watched from a respectful distance. Klaus had anticipated the work would be punishment dressed up as privilege, but as the days accumulated, he discovered something unsettling. It was actually work, real work, the kind of precise, methodical mapping he'd performed aboard the U-boat, plotting courses through treacherous waters. The irony wasn't lost on him, that his skills at navigating toward targets he'd intended to destroy were now being used to bring water to crops that would feed people he'd been trained to consider enemies. Commander Mitchell visited the worksite regularly, sometimes bringing additional maps or updated elevation data, sometimes simply observing progress with the quiet attention of a man who understood the value of precision. He never mentioned the Cuban cigars again, but Klaus noticed that Mitchell always carried a small compass, brass and glass much like his father's, which he consulted with the same obsessive frequency Klaus recognized in himself. "You a rancher?" Klaus asked one morning, his English improving daily through necessity and Mitchell's patient corrections. He gestured toward the way Mitchell studied the irrigation patterns with knowledge that went beyond military strategy. Mitchell nodded, his eyes still fixed on the map spread between them. Before the war. Cattle, mostly, some cotton. He traced a finger along a proposed water channel. Water is life out here. You understand this, I think. Navigation at sea, you know what it means when resources are limited. The comparison caught Klaus completely off guard. He'd never considered the similarities between rationing fresh water on a submarine and managing irrigation in the desert. But the underlying principle was identical. Waste meant death, careful planning meant survival. For the first time since his capture, Klaus felt something approaching professional respect for an American. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in August, carried by Sofia Martinez, the Red Cross volunteer who'd become a familiar presence in the camp. Klaus had noticed her before, a small woman with dark eyes and calloused hands who moved through the barracks with the quiet efficiency of someone comfortable in multiple worlds. She spoke German well enough to translate letters and Spanish when consoling homesick prisoners who reminded her of her own brothers. "From Germany," she said simply, holding out an envelope that looked like it had traveled across half the world to reach him, from Anna Weber. Klaus's hands trembled as he took the letter, his fingers tracing the familiar handwriting that had sustained him through countless nights beneath the ocean's surface. Anna's letters had been his anchor to the world above water, to the possibility that something beyond war and death and the endless grey of submarine corridors might still exist. He read the letter 3 times before the words fully registered. Anna was alive. The bombing of Hamburg had destroyed their neighborhood, their church, the cafe where they'd shared their first cup of real coffee together. But Anna had survived. She was living with her sister in the countryside now, helping with the harvest, trying to rebuild something from the ruins of everything they'd known. That evening, Mitchell appeared at Klaus's bunk with the wooden humidor under his arm. Without a word, he set it on the small table beside Klaus's bed and withdrew 2 Montecristos, offering one to Klaus as he had that first night weeks ago. "Good news, I think," Mitchell asked, nodding toward the letter Klaus still held. Klaus accepted the cigar this time, no longer seeing it as a trap, but not yet understanding what it might mean instead. "Yes, good news." He struggled for the right English words. "She lives. My Anna lives." Mitchell lit both cigars with a worn silver lighter that looked like it had seen decades of use. The smoke rose slowly in the still evening air, carrying with it a richness that Klaus had almost forgotten existed. Luxury without purpose, except the simple pleasure of sharing something good with another person. Other prisoners had gathered around, drawn by the unusual sight of their most cautious comrade smoking with the camp commander. Hans approached tentatively, his young face still marked by uncertainty about how to navigate this strange world where enemies offered cigars and work felt like purpose rather than punishment. Mitchell reached into the humidor again and withdrew enough cigars for the small group of men who'd formed around them. One by one, he lit each Montecristo with the same careful attention, the flame casting warm light across faces that had learned to expect cruelty but were slowly relearning the possibility of kindness. A portable radio crackled to life nearby, playing Benny Goodman's clarinet weaving through Sing, 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 with the kind of joyful complexity that made Klaus think of Anna dancing in their tiny Hamburg apartment. The music filled the spaces between conversation, creating something Klaus hadn't experienced since before the war, a moment that existed purely for its own sake, untainted by strategy or survival, or the constant calculation of threat. "This music," Klaus said, drawing on the Cuban tobacco, "is not what we hear about America in Germany." Mitchell smiled, the first genuine expression Klaus had seen from him. "Probably a lot of things aren't what you heard about America in Germany." As the evening deepened and the cigars burned down to glowing embers, Klaus found himself wondering if Mitchell might be right. Everything he'd been taught about American barbarism seemed to crumble a little more each day, replaced by something more complex and harder to categorize, not perfection, but a kind of stubborn insistence on treating enemies as human beings worthy of dignity. The doubt that had protected him for so long began to feel less like armor and more like prison bars, keeping him from something he wasn't yet ready to name but was beginning to desperately want. The flash flood came without warning on a September morning that had dawned clear and deceptively calm. Klaus was working the irrigation survey when the distant rumble reached his ears. Not thunder, but something deeper and more ominous. He looked up from his maps to see a wall of brown water racing down the usually dry creek bed that wound past the camp and toward the town of Cedar Springs, 3 miles away. "Flood," he called out in English, then German, his navigator's instincts immediately calculating speed and trajectory. The water would reach the town in less than an hour, and from what he could see of the churning debris, tree limbs, fence posts, what looked like part of a barn roof, this wasn't the kind of gentle overflow that farmers sometimes welcomed for their fields. Mitchell appeared within minutes, summoned by guards who'd heard Klaus's shouts. The camp commander took one look at the approaching torrent and made a decision that would have been unthinkable in any German prison Klaus had heard described. "I need volunteers," Mitchell announced to the assembled prisoners. "American volunteers are already heading to town with sandbags. Anyone who wants to help can come with me." The silence stretched long enough for Klaus to count his own heartbeat. Then Hans stepped forward, his young face determined despite the tremor in his voice. "I go." One by one, other prisoners joined them, first the men from Klaus's work detail, then others who'd been watching from the barracks. Within 20 minutes, 37 German prisoners were loaded into military trucks alongside American guards, racing toward a Texas town that most of them couldn't even pronounce. Cedar Springs was chaos when they arrived. The creek had already jumped its banks, sending muddy water rushing through Main Street while residents struggled to move furniture and belongings to higher ground. Klaus saw children being carried to safety, elderly people helped from their homes, and everywhere the controlled panic of a community fighting for survival. An American civilian, a man in his 50s with calloused rancher's hands, looked at the truck full of German prisoners with undisguised suspicion. "You sure about this, Commander? These boys are still the enemy." Mitchell's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Today they're just men with strong backs who know how to work. And work they did." Klaus found himself paired with a local farmer named Jim Peterson, a man who spoke with the slow drawl of someone who'd spent his entire life coaxing life from stubborn soil. They worked side by side, filling sandbags, their conversation limited to gestures and the occasional shared grunt of effort. But Klaus quickly recognized the farmer's expertise in reading water flow and predicting where it would strike hardest. "You know rivers?" Peterson observed during a brief rest, wiping sweat from his forehead with a red bandana. Klaus nodded, thinking of all the currents he'd studied from beneath the ocean surface. "Water goes where water wants to go," he said. "We can only suggest different path." Peterson smiled at that, the first genuine warmth Klaus had seen from any American civilian. "You got that right, son." By afternoon, they'd built a network of sandbag walls that successfully diverted the worst of the flood away from the town's center. Houses that would have been destroyed remained dry, and the main road stayed passable for emergency vehicles. Klaus worked until his back ached and his hands bled from the rough burlap, driven by something he couldn't quite name. Not patriotism for a country that wasn't his, but something deeper and more personal. The local newspaper photographer captured the scene, German prisoners and American civilians working together, their uniforms equally mud-stained, their faces equally determined. The headline would read, "German heroes help save Cedar Springs," and Klaus would keep that newspaper clipping for the rest of his life. Not because of the praise, but because of how foreign the word hero felt when applied to him by people he'd been taught to consider enemies. That evening, back at camp, Mitchell introduced something new to Klaus's education, teaching navigation to fellow prisoners as vocational training. The sessions took place after dinner in the mess hall, where Klaus spread maps across the long tables and demonstrated compass readings, triangulation techniques, and the careful mathematics of plotting courses through uncertain terrain. Klaus proved an eager student, his quick mind grasping concepts that had taken Klaus years to master. But it was the older prisoners who surprised him most. Men like Klaus Weber, a former merchant marine who'd spent decades navigating commercial routes, and Otto Kellner, a geology professor who understood terrain in ways that complemented Klaus's maritime experience. After the war, Franz said one evening as they worked through a complex triangulation problem, "There will be much rebuilding. Germany will need men who can map new roads, plan new cities. Klaus had never thought beyond survival, beyond the war's end, beyond the simple hope of returning to Anna. But sitting in that American mess hall, surrounded by fellow prisoners who were slowly transforming from defeated soldiers into students preparing for an uncertain future, he began to imagine possibilities he'd never dared consider. Maybe America wasn't the evil empire Nazi propaganda had painted. Maybe Germans weren't the master race his own propaganda had claimed. Maybe the world was more complex and more hopeful than any government had been willing to admit. The thought both thrilled and terrified him, opening doors in his mind that he'd kept locked since childhood. If everything he'd believed about America was wrong, what else might be wrong? And if enemies could become teachers, students, even friends, what did that say about the war they'd all been fighting? Klaus looked around the mess hall at the faces bent over maps and compass readings, American guards watching with benign interest rather than suspicion, and felt something shift inside him. Not betrayal of his oath as a German officer, but expansion of his understanding of what that oath might actually mean. The letter wasn't where Klaus had left it. He'd been reorganizing Mitchell's desk while the commander attended a meeting with visiting Red Cross officials, a task that had become routine over the weeks since Klaus had proven himself reliable with administrative work. The irrigation maps were exactly where they belonged, the compass readings filed in chronological order, but tucked beneath a stack of requisition forms was an envelope bearing the seal of the War Department. Klaus knew he shouldn't read it. Every instinct honed by 4 years of military discipline screamed at him to replace the papers exactly as he'd found them and forget what he'd seen. But the letter was addressed to Mitchell, and Klaus recognized his own name in the first paragraph, visible through the thin government paper. His hands moved without conscious permission, unfolding the document that would shatter everything he'd begun to believe about honor, friendship, and the possibility of trust between enemies. Subject: Intelligence gathering from German POW Klaus Weber. The letter began. Your reports on submarine navigation techniques have been invaluable to naval intelligence. Continue developing relationship with subject. Priority information needed: torpedo firing solutions, depth charge evasion tactics, U-boat communication protocols. Klaus read the words 3 times before their meaning fully penetrated the shock that had numbed his thinking. Every conversation, every shared cigar, every moment he'd begun to trust Mitchell's genuine respect. It had all been an elaborate performance designed to extract military secrets from a prisoner foolish enough to believe in American honor. The compass readings he'd taught to fellow prisoners, the navigation techniques he'd demonstrated with such pride, the stories he'd shared about life aboard a submarine, all of it had been carefully harvested by a man who'd offered Cuban cigars while mining Klaus's memories for intelligence that could kill other German sailors. When Mitchell returned an hour later, Klaus was still sitting at the desk. The letter lay open before him like evidence of a terrible miscalculation, a crime of judgment he should have seen coming from miles away. The commander appeared in the doorway, and his entire face shifted in an instant. The comfortable ease that had been there moments before simply vanished. Klaus? Mitchell's voice came carefully, the way a man speaks when he senses something dangerous but can't quite locate the threat. Klaus rose from his chair, each movement deliberate and measured, even though fury was building like steam inside him. He reached for the wooden humidor sitting on Mitchell's desk, the same box that had held those precious Montecristo cigars. Those cigars he'd believed meant something real, some genuine bridge between them. You make me believe, Klaus said, his English breaking apart under the weight of what he'd discovered. You make me betray my oath. He threw the humidor downward. It hit the wooden floor and burst into pieces. Cuban cigars tumbled everywhere, their rich tobacco scattering across official documents that suddenly looked exactly like what they must have always been. The apparatus of espionage. Mitchell didn't step back, didn't try to defend himself, didn't even pretend to be shocked. He simply stood looking at the scattered cigars with something close to regret in his eyes. Then he met Klaus directly. I can explain. Explain. Klaus's voice rose, a shout that brought running footsteps echoing through the corridors. Explain how you turn me into a traitor, how you take my trust and use it for your reports. The office door burst open and guards rushed in, rifles raised and ready, but nobody was quite sure what they were supposed to do. Mitchell waved them away, keeping his eyes on Klaus the entire time. Stand down. Everything's under control. But nothing was under control, and everyone knew it. The story spread through camp like wildfire. Prisoners who'd seen Klaus marched away to solitary confinement told everyone who'd listen. Guards who'd heard the shouting from Mitchell's office passed the news along. Within hours, the careful balance Mitchell had created between fair treatment and security began to fall apart. Other prisoners who'd respected Klaus as a leader began whispering that he was a collaborator. American guards who'd grown relaxed around the German inmates became suspicious again, watching for tricks in every friendly word. Even Sofia Martinez seemed changed when she brought Klaus his dinner in solitary, her usual warmth replaced by something professional and distant. "Did you know?" Klaus asked desperately through the meal slot, needing some confirmation that his judgment wasn't completely shattered. Sophia hesitated. In that pause, Klaus had his answer. She'd suspected something or known something, and she'd said nothing while he made himself look foolish, trusting someone who'd been playing a much longer game than Klaus had understood. The jazz music that usually drifted through the camp in the evenings stopped completely. The navigation classes didn't happen anymore. Even the work details became tense and suspicious instead of the cooperative effort they'd been. Klaus found himself isolated by prisoners, afraid his collaboration would contaminate them, while the Americans watched him as a security threat whose usefulness had ended the moment he discovered the truth. Alone in his cell, Klaus held Anna's letter, perhaps the only genuine thing left in a world built from careful lies. She wrote about their future together, about rebuilding their lives in a Germany that would rise from the war's ruins stronger and more wise. But Klaus couldn't picture that future anymore, couldn't imagine ever trusting his own judgment again. His father's compass sat on the small table by his cot, its needle pointing north with complete reliability regardless of the turmoil filling his chest. The instrument still worked perfectly, still gave accurate readings, but Klaus no longer believed he could interpret what those readings meant. If Mitchell had deceived him so completely, how could Klaus trust anything he felt or believed about what came next? The Cuban cigars seemed clear to him now. They'd been exotic gifts from captors to captives, gestures that looked generous but covered a calculated purpose. He'd been drawn in by the appearance of respect and dignity, never understanding that his imprisonment had just become more subtle than he'd imagined. Everything he'd started to hope for, friendship crossing from one side to the other, the possibility of honor even in loss, a future built on something other than hate, had shattered like that humidor on Mitchell's floor. 3 weeks later, a different Red Cross volunteer arrived with another letter, her face blank and careful as she slipped the envelope through the meal slot. Klaus didn't even need to open it. He knew this letter would finish destroying whatever remained of his hope. Anna was gone. Allied bombers had destroyed her life 2 months back, not in the first raid he'd already heard about, but in a second wave that came down on the refugee camps where people had gathered after the initial attack. She'd been tending to injured children when those bombers returned, and according to Anna's sister, she died immediately when the makeshift medical station took a direct strike. Klaus read the words once, then carefully folded the letter and placed it on his table beside his father's compass. He felt nothing, no grief, no anger, no numbness either, just an absence where his future used to be. A hollow space that consumed every image he'd held of what he'd built when this war finally ended. He stopped eating, not from any real decision, just from complete indifference about whether his body continued on. The guards noticed within a few days and reported it to medical staff, who discussed force-feeding if things got worse. Klaus found their concern almost amusing. Such careful attention to keeping alive a man who'd lost every reason to want life. On the 4th day, Mitchell appeared at his cell carrying that wooden box, a replacement humidor with new Cuban cigars inside. The camp commander sat outside the bars on the cold floor, his back against the corridor wall, and carefully pulled out 2 cigars exactly the way he had that first night when everything had seemed possible. "I need to tell you something," Mitchell said quietly, lighting both cigars even though Klaus gave no response. The smoke curled through the cell bars, carrying memories of evenings when friendship had felt real. Klaus lay on his cot staring at nothing, but Mitchell spoke anyway, as if they were having an ordinary conversation. Yes, Washington gave me orders. They wanted intelligence reports. They told me to build a relationship with you, to find out about submarine tactics, navigation, anything that might help us win. Mitchell drew on his cigar, the tip glowing in the dark corridor. But I never sent those reports. The words came through Klaus's numbness slowly, like sound traveling through deep water. Klaus turned to look at Mitchell for the first time in weeks. I wrote them, Mitchell said, continuing, detailed reports about everything you shared with me, every technique, every story. Then I filed them in my desk drawer and told Washington you were uncooperative and unwilling to talk about technical matters. Klaus pushed himself up slowly, his weak body objecting to the movement. Why? Mitchell stayed quiet, studying the compass he always carried with him. The brass and glass instrument that Klaus suddenly recognized wasn't identical to his own by chance, but because both men understood what navigation meant to people who'd spent their lives searching for direction in uncertain places. My son died at Pearl Harbor, Mitchell said at last. 22 years old, full of righteous conviction that he was fighting against evil. He believed everything we told him about Germans being monsters, just the way you probably believed what they told you about Americans being barbaric. Mitchell held his cigar up, looking at the glowing end as though it held answers to questions he'd carried for years. But you weren't a monster. You were a man doing his work with integrity, protecting his crew, trying to get home to someone he loved. My boy was exactly the same way. We all were. Something split open inside Klaus's chest. Not his heart breaking, but his walls finally fracturing under all the pressure. Anna is dead. I know, Sophia told me. Mitchell's voice carried real sorrow, not the practiced sympathy of an officer, but genuine grief from someone who understood what loss meant. I'm sorry. The cigars your father gave you gave them to the enemy. Mitchell smiled, and Klaus saw authentic warmth there. My father's last box. He died believing Americans fought honorably, that we were different from our enemies because we saw prisoners as human beings, not just obstacles. I gave them to you because you showed me what honor looks like, even in defeat. Klaus took the offered cigar with hands that trembled from weakness and something deeper. As Mitchell lit it with that same careful attention from that first evening, Klaus felt the walls around his heart beginning to give way. I betrayed my oath, Klaus whispered. You shared your knowledge with men who wanted to build better lives afterward, Mitchell corrected. You helped save an American town from flooding. You treated enemies with dignity even when you had every reason to hate us. If that's betrayal, we need more of it in this world. Sophia appeared down the corridor holding a tray of real food, not the prison rations Klaus had grown used to, something that smelled like actual home cooking. She'd been watching over him despite his rejection, making sure he lived long enough to hear truths that might give him reasons to keep living. As Klaus drew on the Cuban tobacco and felt its richness fill lungs that had forgotten real pleasure, he understood that Mitchell's gift had never been about intelligence or manipulation. It was recognition, one navigator seeing another, one man who understood responsibility, reaching across enemy lines to touch the humanity that war tried to destroy. The war was finished. Germany had fallen weeks before, though news reached the camp slowly. Soon Klaus would need to decide whether to return to his ruined country or find some other path forward. But sitting in that Texas cell, sharing Cuban cigars with a man who'd risked everything to protect his dignity, Klaus finally grasped what true navigation meant. It wasn't about crossing oceans or battlefields. It was about finding your way across the distance between enemies and family.